The Public Safety Committee is now called to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Alderman Boyd. Alderman Vaccaro. Alderman Cone. Alderman Arnowitz. Alderwoman Hubbard.
Present.
Alderman Kotar. Alderwoman Spencer. Alderman Muhammad. Alderwoman Boyd.
Present.
Chairman Kennedy.
Here.
4 present.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, would you please excuse Alderman Arnowitz, Kotar, and Boyd?
So noted.
We have before the committee here today Board Bill 134 that's sponsored by Alderwoman Megan Green. If you'd come forward and talk a little bit about the bill. Our primary thing here today is to hear her presentation about the bill and then to listen to any of the testimony that I believe you had some individuals you wanted to testify, and then we also have those of the public. We welcome everyone who is here today who has also signed, and whether you've signed or not, we welcome you to the committee hearing today on Board Bill 134. You can begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to members of the committee for coming out today. Board Bill 134, I'm going to pass out some handouts here of the Washington, D.C. ordinance, which I think was also emailed out to Chairman Kennedy for the committee. But essentially, Board Bill 134 starts to develop a comprehensive protest response plan for the city of St. Louis. It's one of the calls of action for us under the Ferguson Commission report, and it's one of the things that I think we're seeing more and more we need to get in place for the city of St. Louis. This bill was drafted in close consultation with the ACLU and the MacArthur Justice Center, both of which will come up and testify in a minute. Basically modeled around a lot of what Washington, D.C. has in place. And we know that, Washington, D.C. has a lot of protests. They've learned how to manage them in a way where they are protecting First Amendment rights, where they're not overusing chemical agents, where they're not using kettling, and things that unfortunately we have seen, not just in this latest round of protests, but dating back to 2014, when the district that I represent, the ward that I represent, had 100 residents who were tear gassed within a coffee shop and could not get out of the coffee shop. And as a result of that, there were several lawsuits that happened and a court order about requiring notice for dispersal of chemical agents. Yet what we've seen since then is that that dispersal order hasn't necessarily always been given, and the things that were laid out in that injunction have not been followed. And so kind of the next step of that is to create a legislative fix to put us in line with some best practices for protest response to really protect First Amendment rights. So what this bill does is a couple of things. It repeals our constitutionally vague definition of unlawful assembly. One of the problems we have right now is nobody really knows what our unlawful assembly ordinance means because it is so vague. The second thing it does is it establishes a First Amendment policy for the city to safeguard free speech and to set clear guidelines for officer involvement when it comes to protests. It requires that officers provide clear, audible notices when those assembled are required to disperse, and provide routes to make sure that people have the ability to get out, the ability to disperse when those orders are given. It also mandates that the police shall not take any action to prevent or interfere with the ability of the media or the press to document what is occurring, including legal observers. Specifies that law enforcement must wear name tags in visible locations, even when they are wearing riot gear. Requires SLMPD to promptly process arrestees and release those eligible for immediate release. What we've been seeing recently too is that that protesters for the Stockley verdict, protesters for Mike Brown, have been treated differently than protesters related to the Fight for 15 or the Trump rally or whatever, in terms of the amount of time that they're being held after arrest. And we're seeing, non-police protest-related activities, people being released within a matter of hours. But when people are protesting police brutality, they can sometimes be held for days with the exact same charges, not a different situation. This bill also limits the use of chemical agents on individuals, and these include a prohibition on the use of chemical agents against any person who is restrained, and a prohibition against using chemical agents just to disperse people from an area. It puts in guidance and limits on the use of chemical agents that require officers to give warning that must be audible within 40 feet and time to leave the area before deploying those agents. This takes us a step toward the Ferguson Commission recommendation of developing a comprehensive response plan, and like I said previously, it is modeled after Washington, D.C.'s ordinance, which they have done a pretty phenomenal job in crafting legislation that creates these guidelines. One organization that wanted to testify today could not be here today, and that's the Ethical Society of Police, but I have a letter of support from them that I can hand out to the committee, and then I would like to call the first organization, if that's all right. Jeffrey Mittman from the ACLU.
This is one of your special guests here today.
Yes.
Okay. You also have
Chairman Kennedy, alderpersons, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Jeffrey Mittman. I'm the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Missouri. On behalf of our thousands of members here in St. Louis City and County and across the state of Missouri, our mandate is to preserve and expand the constitutional rights and civil liberties of all Missourians as guaranteed under the U.S. and Missouri constitutions. We advocate for policy change, but we do so in a nonpartisan manner. If you'll allow me, I've provided written testimony that summarizes our reasons for supporting this bill. We appreciate the opportunity to share our testimony. I'd like to provide some background of why we think this bill is so important. Based on our work here in Missouri and ACLU affiliates across the country, and based on knowledge that we all have as St. Louisans, policing is hard. It's dangerous. Police officers put their lives on the line, and we know that they feel embattled and as if their professional responsibilities are not protected. Similarly, here in St. Louis and across the country, being a person of color, particularly an African-American young man, is hard and likewise dangerous. Moreover, what we have seen from recent incidents historically repeated here in St. Louis, being a protester, seeking to exercise your constitutional rights is hard and on occasion dangerous. What can we do about it? Holistically, globally, the answer is collaborative policing. We all need to come together. The mayor, the board of aldermen, the police chief, the representatives of the police union, line officers and their supervisors, as well as organizations such as the ACLU, the MacArthur Justice Center, and policing experts, along with members of the community. We have to start a new type of policing where we work together to discuss how to reconnect trust and confidence so that the police are there to protect and serve, and the community members support their work. In the meantime, until we reach that conversation and we reach the policing we deserve, there are things we can do to move forward. The ACLU advocates for change through three means: litigation, legislation, and public education. As you are aware, we've sued the city of St. Louis for violations of constitutional rights. That's our litigation aspect. We continue to work with you and with other members of the public to publicly educate. This legislation is an important step of that tool. We note in our testimony the city of Washington, D.C. has several thousand protests between the years 2014 and 2016, including over 200 with 1,000 individuals or more. They use guidelines similar to what is encompassed here. It is a false dichotomy to say that we can either have safety and policing that is empowered to protect individuals from violence or criminal activity, or we can have robust First Amendment rights. We can and should have both. This bill recognizes that the current standard in the city of St. Louis is broad and vague. It does not give good guidance to our police officers as to what is an unlawful assembly. We are putting their reputations, their lives, their ability to police effectively at risk by not giving them the standards they need. When and how to use chemical agents, similar standards are lacking. This bill addresses that. It's a good step forward. We appreciate and are happy to support the efforts of Alderperson Green, and we appreciate your consideration. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. We can take questions from members of the committee. Alderman Vaccaro?
I actually have quite a few, and I know there's going to be several meetings, so I'd like to hear the police, not just the ethical, but the association. But when the city of St. Louis does these, there's always a chance that the state's going to come in, which they have almost on every time, and said, you can't do that. And the only reason I say that is because we aid the county aids us, the highway patrol. Putting these things in place, how do we prevent the highway patrol? How do we prevent what happens when they come in? Do we check them at the border? These things need to be done just like the other stuff where the states come back and whacked us 2 times now. These things need to be done in a much larger area, especially where you have aid from other communities come in.
Yeah,
And how do we solve that without doing this statewide?
Yeah. Alderman, thank you for the question. Yes, unfortunately, we have too often seen in Jefferson City instances where the idea of local control, the idea of giving power down to the people is promoted in word, but when we here in the city of St. Louis do something, indeed, it's a little different. We recognize that. I will tell you that the ACLU Missouri has been working for over 3 years now with individuals, with both Republicans and Democrats in Jefferson City. We will be working with co-sponsors on a bipartisan basis to introduce policing reform legislation there. I can tell you as well that we've had important conversations with both Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate and House, and to include policing leaders at the Highway Patrol, at the Public Safety Commission, and organizations representing sheriffs. They understand a change needs to happen. Does that guarantee that the legislature and the General Assembly would not come and counteract the work we do? No. But what we know is that there is an understanding there is a problem. Part 2, as we mentioned in the letter and as provided to the court, the Ferguson consent decree is an excellent model in the county that others are aware of that has worked as well. So this is not an instance where St. Louis would be going out ahead of other cities doing something radically different, doing something that would invite attention from the General Assembly. As we noted in our testimony, Chicago has something similar. So is there a guarantee that the Assembly wouldn't act? No, but given that this is mainstream legislation, that these standards are common and considered best practices, and given our conversations with the General Assembly on statewide policing issues, we feel this is not something that would draw their attention in that way. I never want to predict, but again, this is not going far out ahead.
I would say it's definitely going to draw their attention, and they will probably take local control back away from us. They gave it to us, and they'll probably pull it away. I mean, from some of the people that talk to me that are up there, they're like, you guys are way off on where you're going with stuff. And I'm just telling you, I mean, between this and the marijuana bill and some other stuff, it's just a comment. But anyway, thank you.
Alderman Cone? Any
I don't
questions?
have any questions at
Okay.
this time.
Alderwoman Hubbard?
No questions, but I do have a question for the sponsor.
You have a question? We'll bring her back up then. There's a question for the sponsor, but we'll bring you back up in a moment. Let's finish through this. Alderwoman Spencer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mittman, for being here today. Can you walk us through the involvement of the ACLU in writing of this legislation?
Certainly. What the ACLU tries to do whenever possible is not to reinvent the wheel. We feel our advocacy is always based on what does the Constitution mandate. We try to be clear when we provide testimony, when we litigate, when we educate. Our mandate is to look at what the Constitution says, to look at what existing statutes say, and to advise as to whether or not the courts have ruled on these matters and whether or not what is being recommended comports with jurisprudence. So, for example, on matters such as unlawful assembly, our recent litigation has brought to the attention of the Federal District Court that the standard in St. Louis is unworkable, is constitutionally impermissible and vague. With respect to use of chemical agents, again, looking at best practices. With respect to kettling and arrest practices, what we did is when there's an existing model that has been shown to be effective, that has not been challenged or has not been found to be subject to challenge in court, we will always recommend, here is what works, here's the information we're using, here's the case law. So in this case, it is largely drawn on the standard that has been used in Washington, D.C. As we noted in our testimony, for 2 years between 2014 and 16, that standard has been used effectively. As always, these sorts of bills are complicated. If there are additional questions, if additional research is required, we're always happy to do that, and we believe it is our mandate to provide information, to give you what the case law has said, what other statutes have said, so that you can make the policy decisions.
Would you say that the ACLU is just supporting this legislation, or did the ACLU aid in its construction?
You know, it's an interesting question. Here's what I say, is because we're a constitutional rights organization, we believe strongly in the idea of 3 branches of government. It is always and only the mandate of legislative bodies such as yourself to draft legislation. We don't do that. We can't do that. You represent the people. We can advise and assist in whatever way we are requested to do so within constitutional, statutory, and ethical limits. We provide advice. We lobby. Both in a public education way and in an advocacy way. So our job is to support the legislative body, to give voice to the people in educating and advocating before a legislative body, but any work we do is simply as a proxy or supporter or an advisor to the legislative body itself.
We just received the ordinance here that this board bill would repeal. Ordinance 1552010. Thank you to our council for providing that to us. This is a very short ordinance. I agree that there is there's obviously some vagueness here, and what is before us is the replacement of this sort of one paragraph with a much more significant set of rules. Can you walk us through what your guidance would be as far as the most important aspects of these new rules? We haven't gone through detail really what this new ordinance does, but from the perspective of the ACLU, can you guide us through some of the most important components?
Absolutely. As I don't need to tell this body, legislating is hard. You can never legislate for every single eventuality. You can look around and see what practices have occurred, where there have been problems or violations. You can look to other municipalities or similar bodies and guide that way. So I do not want to pretend that this bill as currently drafted, that we would ever say it is perfect, that it cannot be improved, expanded, revised, amended, that there couldn't be compromises. However, what we are focusing on is recent St. Louis history, and that is highlighted in our litigation before the federal court. We know, both in the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting and the protests, and in the aftermath of the Stockley verdict, there have been specific, repeated, and consistent violations of constitutional rights by the St. Louis police. What are those? 1, unlawful and unconstitutional declarations of a quote-unquote unlawful assembly. The constitutional First Amendment standard is that we, as Missourians, have the right to nonviolently protest. We have the right to gather together, to advocate for change, to be on the streets, to be in the public places. We cannot be violent. We cannot threaten the safety of others. We cannot commit criminal acts. None of those are protected First Amendment activities. However, what we have seen repeatedly is that the St. Louis Police Department, particularly when protests are protesting against police activity, that they will improperly and unconstitutionally declare an assembly unlawful. They then claim that that gives them the right to arrest everyone, to kettle, to use chemical agents. That is impermissible. It's just bad policing. So what this bill does is it compares the unlawful assembly of the city of St. Louis, the unlawful assembly of the state of Missouri, and then other unlawful assemblies. And it says, what is currently on hand, this idea of two people engaged where one is not stopping the other from doing criminal activity, that's an unlawful assembly. It doesn't work. What are the other issues? Chemical agent, as was reported in the press. At the recent federal court hearing, the judge admonished the attorneys for the city of St. Louis, if you're going to tell me, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, if you're going to tell me that it's okay to take a protester who has their hands zip-tied behind their back and is on the ground and not doing anything, if it's okay to reach down and spray chemical agents in their eyes, that's not good policing. So that is a significant violation. There was testimony during the trial that the police said they generally have the right to use a chemical agent whenever they see fit. Again, paraphrasing, but that is a significant violation. It addresses that. The idea of, as well of kettling, that if you declare that there's an unlawful assembly, whether or not individuals are being given an opportunity to escape, whether or not the time or matter of where the unlawful assembly is and where people can go to, that once it's declared, you can then box everybody in and arrest them whether or not they've been protesting, whether or not they've been engaged in any activity of any kind is problematic. And then finally, of course, respecting the rights of the press. It is appalling that we have documented evidence that members of the press have identified that their cameras were taken from them, that they were arrested, that legal observers who are similarly citizen documenters had their eyes pepper sprayed. That is not acceptable. And again, that sort of gross violation needs to be addressed. So those big, completely unacceptable black and white violations that we have seen documented, this addresses those. Again, can there be more? Can there be revisions? Can there be other issues dealt with? Absolutely. But we try to start with what we know has been occurring.
Well, that does it for the questions I have for you, Mr. Mittman. Thank you for coming down here, and thank you for your involvement in this legislation.
Thanks so much.
Alderwoman Boyd, any questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair.
Alderwoman, your next guest.
I'd like to bring up May Quinn from the MacArthur Justice Center.
Good morning. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak with you today. Again, my name is May Quinn. I'm the director of the MacArthur Justice Center here in St. Louis. We're a civil rights nonprofit law firm. We've been around for 30 years with offices across the country, but we launched an office here in St. Louis just about 2 years ago. And before that time, as you may know, I was a tenured law professor at Washington University, so I speak to you today not just as an advocate and an attorney, but someone who's taught constitutional criminal procedure for the last 12 years, not just at Washington University, but other law schools around the country. And in my work at the Washington University Clinic, in my work at MacArthur Justice, I am well familiar with the practices of local police and how they have approached protesters and those who dare to declare that Black Lives Matter and that there should be police accountability. And we have seen time and again, my staff, my attorneys, and the work that we're doing, that those who protest, those who film police, those, again, who call for accountability in law enforcement, it seems to be for them that the process becomes the punishment. And my good and great colleague, Jeff Mittman, spoke very eloquently about the components of this bill that address the very egregious acts around brutal policing in the streets with tear gas and unlawful and violent physical restraints at times. But we come to this bill to offer some insights with regard to the process thereafter. And I wanted to lift up parts of the bill in particular that we would want to draw to the committee's attention, and that relates to the ways in which persons are processed once they are taken hold of by police. First and foremost, it is absolutely essential that people are not being arrested for events that are non-crimes, right? That we should not be taking into custody anybody on anything that does not amount to unlawful activity. And if we do take hold of a person, as this bill sets forth, the first sort of tier, the first sort of layer that should occur in terms of the analysis for law enforcement is, I've taken hold of this person, but do I need to take them further into custody? Or can I cite them and release them? Cite and release being a practice used across the country for a variety of reasons, primarily because in the instances for which persons are sort of being taken held of by police are not sufficiently serious to process that person. But it also relates to assisting the city in keeping bodies that don't need to be in our jails out of the jails, keeping persons out of the system that don't need to be in the system. And so this bill speaks to that first level of there needing to be an appropriate evaluation of citation and release and a presumption of citation and release in these nonviolent, non-crime, protest-related activities. Then, if in these limited circumstances someone's body is going to be held longer, right, they are going to be processed, then the next analysis needs to be the question of bail. And this is another problem we've seen historically, and that is the wheedling out of protesters, regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their ties to the community, cash bail to get their release from custody. And so this bill does, in essence, what has already begun to happen by way of general order of the municipal court, and that is there's a presumption of release on recognizance. So even if someone's going to be processed, even if someone's going to be put through the system, then the presumption is not that they have to post money, an arbitrary sum based on a schedule, but that it should be released on recognizance. And then the third piece then becomes, well, how does that release on recognizance process happen? And here too the bill tries to address another problem we've seen, and that is the moving of bodies around the city unnecessarily, the holding people in cells in local police stations without letting family or friends know where people are, and it adds a time frame in which people ought to be processed and released of 3 hours. I do think that 3-hour section, there's a reference to 3 hours that should be throughout the entire bill, and it may have only been added to one section, but the idea is that it should be a prompt processing and release, not to treat differently and more harshly those who dare to speak up and out. So those are the ways in which I think in particular this bill is a very good set of first steps for the city. Like Mr. Mittman, I would also point out, our shop is a litigation shop. We did sue the city of St. Louis right behind ACLU relating to Stockley protest activities. And as a result of our lawsuit, as I mentioned, there was then a shift to ROR by way of general order in the municipal court. But, we're not here to say that there will never be any further challenges in court, but this is, of course, I think a good first set of steps for the city to take to get a better handle on the way it's dealing with protest cases.
Thank you. Alderman Vaccaro, any questions? Alderman Cone?
So I just, I want to state my support for this bill. I do think that it's important to have clear and defined policies in place in terms of how we interact with the police and with our, the constituency that the police serve. Were you involved in the drafting of this bill? It sounds as though you were.
I was presented with one version of the bill, asked if I supported it, and then I made some suggestions around certain language, but it's, as I mentioned, my focus is on a particular part of the bill. I did not draft the bill, and I offered some suggestions as to certain language. In particular, as I noted, the ROR order that was in place, I thought needed to be brought to the attention of the council.
So and reading this, I mean, it really does spell out fairly clearly, what is defined as a lawful assembly, what's a, unlawful assembly. I guess my concern or question, if you have a peaceful demonstration, which by and large, almost every demonstration we've had over the last, 2 months has been very peaceful and very well organized, and I think trying to be considerate of the community while also pushing, for some disruption so that we can effectuate, policy changes, which is, of course, the purpose and intent of these protests and whatnot. So when things become either violent or unlawful, how does that, how would that kind of manifest itself in terms of these policies? So, windows get broken, okay. But, police officers getting hit in the head with bricks, I mean, that's obviously a very dangerous situation for police officers to be in themselves. I wouldn't want protesters being sprayed with chemical agents. Myself and Alderwoman Green actually, a few years back were sprayed with chemical agents as we were trying to disperse from a protest. But, that, I wouldn't expect that of my constituents, in terms of, the police, conducting themselves in that manner, but also wouldn't expect my constituents to be throwing bricks at, police officers either. So when that happens, how do we maintain an active safety environment, for both the protesters and the police, right? Because obviously, you don't want casualties or, individuals harmed on either side. The police are obviously usually well guarded and have their tactical gear on in some cases when that happens. Sometimes they're not, I mean, sometimes, they've just been in their regular gear as well, but how does this policy provide balance, I guess is the question.
And again, I would say most of my comments today were intended to focus to the latter part of the processing, but I think the bill as drafted seeks to stop the sort of arbitrary actions on the part of police calling to an end otherwise lawful protests without going through some sort of protocol, and that when announcements are made relating to danger, safety, that kind of thing, that they're clear, that everyone on the command knows what is happening. I mean, I've deposed officers who, Officer A and Officer B are doing entirely different things at the same protest site, and so I think this set of policies here is a sort of layered protocol to, begin with, generally we shouldn't be issuing arbitrary dispersal orders. The dispersal orders are to happen only when it's lawful and it's appropriate. When it does happen, it needs to be sufficiently conveyed and in an even-handed way, and we have just not seen that happening to date, that it is arbitrary and that officers sort of unilaterally are deciding they don't like this protester, or maybe even they know this protester, and so you, sir, will now be arrested because you didn't respond quickly to my on-the-spot decision to say X or Y.
So I guess my question, though, as it pertains to the kind of back end of this, if someone is arrested and processed, this bill is supposed to outline policies in terms of how the police are supposed to conduct themselves with regard to lawful and unlawful protests. And so, in theory, if this is enacted, which I hope it is, but in theory, if this is enacted, the police shouldn't be arresting people who are pastors or, community activists that are out there just filming, or, journalists, So in theory, those people shouldn't even be processed.
Right.
Right? If this is enacted. So if this is
Whether it's enacted or not, that shouldn't be happening, but.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That being said, if this is enacted and those folks aren't now being arrested, the folks who are being arrested are the agitators that are, throwing bricks at the police or breaking windows or what have you. Should those folks be released on their own recognizance as well? I mean, if they're causing physical bodily damage to to officers or people who are causing property damage?
Yeah. They just keep in mind, municipal ordinances in the city of St. Louis are not crimes. They are civil violations, right? So I like to talk about this like if it was a family law violation or a tort or a breach of contract. We generally don't arrest people for those things, but municipal ordinances are essentially the same in terms of the level of violation. They're not crimes. If someone hucks a brick at an officer and it's clear, the officer has a range of things available to them. They can charge them in municipal court, but they could also charge them in criminal court. Right. And if they're charged in criminal court, at least at this point, as far as I'm aware, they are not applying an ROR presumption. I think they ought to for misdemeanors as well. But, you know, there's a range of possibilities available there. I don't think anyone is suggesting that violent activity should be rewarded or that appropriate response by police should be hemmed in. But currently, the law of the City of St. Louis, by way of an order of Judge McCoy, is that ROR is the presumption in all municipal matters, and that's consistent with Missouri Supreme Court law, with limited exceptions.
So, and I want to thank you for that clarity too, because I think what is helpful for myself, other members of the committee, and those who are watching that may not be entirely familiar with the circumstances or situations. That the officers do have other charges that are available to them in the event that something does go awry. And so, so thank you for that. I don't have any other questions at this point in time for this particular speaker. Thank you very much.
Alderwoman Hubbard. Alderwoman Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. In reviewing this proposed legislation, were you also looking at existing St. Louis Police Department policies?
Yeah, I will say I'm familiar with existing St. Louis Police Department policies. I'm also familiar with the testimony of officers who I've engaged in depositions in various cases, and the ways in which, for them, if the policies are not clear, there surely seems to be some maybe different practices than actual policies. So yes.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if this is the appropriate witness to ask a couple of questions about our current police department policies, but I have some questions related to, one of the things that this bill does is describe name tag requirements, detention guidelines, specifically to people being detained for unlawful assembly. But I'm curious in a general sense how that compares to our general St. Louis Police Department name tag requirements. Right. What are the protocols for adhering to those, under what circumstances, and annual reporting. The annual reporting for this, for individuals arrested for unlawful assembly, and how does that compare to other reports that our police department may or may not produce? But
yeah, I don't necessarily think it's appropriate,
yep.
But we do have someone coming in from the police. We also have the chief. We're scheduling the chief in, so there may be another opportunity.
Okay.
If I might just respond briefly to one bit on the policy point, one thing that seems clear to me, the current St. Louis City Police Department policies acknowledge that there should be a citation and release presumption in most municipal matters. So there too, this is not all that new. It's consistent. It's just that it's being ignored currently, and I think in the hands of individual officers, they're interpreting it perhaps in different ways, or their commanders are giving them misinformation and not appropriate training around current cite and release policies that are on the books.
Okay. And did you want to speak on any of those other questions? I mean, regarding, okay. All right, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. Alderwoman Boyd.
No questions.
If you have any written tests, if you have,
we will submit it after, if that's okay.
We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Alderwoman.
Thank you. I'd like to bring up Kevin Ellison from Amnesty International.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to share testimony supporting BB 134. My name is Kevin Ellison. I'm legislative coordinator for the state of Missouri for Amnesty International USA. I've been volunteering for the organization in this capacity for 8 years. Just some background on our organization, if you're not familiar. Amnesty International is a global movement of more than 7 million supporters, members, and activists in more than 150 countries and territories who campaign to end grave abuses of human rights. We have over 1 million supporters, members, and activists in the United States. Our vision is for every person to enjoy all the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights standards. We are independent of any government, political ideology, economic interest, or religion, and are funded mainly by our membership and public donations. The right to assemble peacefully is a basic human right, guaranteed not only by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international treaties to which the United States is a party, but also guaranteed by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the laws of the state of Missouri. Amnesty International recognizes the difficult task that law enforcement has in policing large-scale and spontaneous demonstrations. However, assemblies are always diverse gatherings, and individuals do not lose their individual rights simply because a small number of people choose to act in a violent manner. We have grave concerns with the manner in which largely peaceful demonstrations have been handled by law enforcement officers in the city of St. Louis, particularly the seemingly indiscriminate use of tear gas and other chemical irritants, inconsistent and sometimes arbitrary standards of determining an unlawful assembly, and the apparent targeting of members of the traditional press and new media. In 2014, our organization issued a report on the streets of America, human rights in Ferguson. Amnesty International documented the policing of protests after the fatal shooting of Mike Brown. Now, while those observations focus primarily on the tactics used in St. Louis County, the Missouri Highway Patrol, and other assisting agencies, and not specifically on the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, the similarities of what was documented then and what has been documented through media reports and testimony in federal court echoes loudest. Amnesty International USA welcomes Board Bill 134 as a measure that would bridge a gap in an individual's right to assemble. BB 134 clarifies the objective circumstance under which law enforcement can determine an assembly to be unlawful and provides specific steps law enforcement must take to order protesters to disperse and allow them to comply with that order. BB 134 also provides guidelines and on use of chemical agents, requiring a clearly audible announcement of where such chemicals will be deployed, how much time individuals have to cease activity and leave the area, and what route individuals may take to leave the area. The bill also prohibits the use of chemical agents on those that have already been restrained and those whose only violation is not being in order to disperse. The bill further protects members of the traditional press whose duty to observe and report these activities is protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and extends those protections to members of new media, such as those documenting incidents via live stream and other digital means. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and Amnesty International strongly supports this measure and urges you to support it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Vaccaro, any questions?
No questions.
Alderman Cone?
No questions.
Alderwoman Hubbard?
No questions.
Alderwoman Spencer?
No questions.
Alderwoman Boyd?
I have a question. Now, you walk me back through again. You said you all represent, who you represent exactly? When you were
I mean,
saying-
we're an international human rights organization with chapters worldwide, including in the city of St. Louis.
Okay, so you look to protect all people's human rights.
That is correct.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get clarity, because you were talking so fast.
I apologize.
Oh, my God, I'm trying to catch up with you, but okay, thank you. That's what I.
It may be helpful that our organization has sent a letter to the Public Safety Committee in support of this bill. I understand that not all the representatives have had an opportunity to see this. I do have copies of that letter.
That would be helpful. I was going to ask if you had any written comments.
I said you got the trees again, so.
Is this your
Yes.
testimony?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Alderwoman?
For my last speaker, I'd like to invite up Representative Bruce Franks.
Okay.
Thank you, Donna.
Chairman, and all members of the committee. First, I want to say we shouldn't use we shouldn't use Jeff City as a scapegoat not to push certain legislation, because there's been a lot of legislations passed by the board in the past couple years. And what I've been hearing lately is what Jeff City's going to do, what Jeff City's going to do. We have unique problems. We have unique issues, as do other parts of Missouri. So whenever we have the opportunity to push forward on legislation that's going to affect the citizens of the city of St. Louis, I believe, just my personal opinion, that we should be doing so, because we protest in St. Louis. They're not protesting in Pemmican County. They're not protesting in Cass County, major parts of Jackson County, Springfield. They're not protesting like we are. They don't have the police response like we've had the police response to the protest. So to say that what Jeff City's going to do and kind of turn a blind eye, I know that's not what you're doing, but for lack of a better term, turning a blind eye to what we've been going through out there when it comes to police response. I don't agree with that. I do agree with this bill. And as a legislator, one thing I've learned in the past year is that all legislation could be better. But the way we get it better is by working together. This bill speaks to a couple things that, when it comes to personal experience, one thing in particular is the use of chemical agents. I know it's been said, but I'm going to reiterate. Whenever somebody's handcuffed or already restrained and we're using pepper spray, that's an issue. When there was testimony in the lawsuit the ACLU brought forward, Lieutenant Sachs, who's actually over Mobile Reserve and SWAT, said that we don't have a playbook. We don't have a blueprint, basically saying that whatever happens, happens. When it comes to the kettling, take for instance, there was an action on the highway. And as folks exited the highway and as folks joined on different parts of that same street, we were boxed in. And as we were boxed in, there was a light order saying this is an unlawful assembly. There's a sidewalk. We all got up on the sidewalk. As we got on the sidewalk, the police cut the sidewalk off as well and began to close us in and say, move, move, rhythmic and together. Where are we moving to? If you're closing us in from all four corners, where are we supposed to move? And so there was mass arrest. And when we looked at those particular reasonings for arrest, everybody got the same exact charge, even the folks that weren't on the highway. Same way with the kettling that happened downtown. We have to enact legislation that's going to bring forth accountability when it comes to the police department. Because if I throw a brick and hit a police officer, we know what that accountability looks like. But if an officer pepper sprays a 57-year-old woman who's handcuffed and sitting Indian style on the ground, or if an officer pepper sprays one of our live streamers who's confined to a wheelchair, that's not okay. An elected official who just asked a question, that's not okay. Using chemical agents without the proper warning to disperse is not okay. Even in an instance where we have an undercover officer, an officer that was placed inside of our protest, a black officer, we wouldn't have known he was even in our protest or an undercover officer had not the police beat him up. Those are issues that we have to deal with. We have to deal with the way that police respond to our protests, the way they respond to black folks. Because at the end of the day, it's our job to push forward this legislation. No matter what part of the city you live in, no matter what part of the city you represent, you make decisions for each and every part of the city, just like I make decisions for each and every part of the state. And when I don't know about certain things in other parts of the state, I go to that representative and I talk to them. I'll even go to their neighborhoods and talk to their constituents. So now you have the opportunity to talk to some of the folks who have been going through what they've been going through out there, and not just newspapers, not just news clips, and not just hearsay, and not just a particular ward that's pro-police, and see that police can do no wrong. So whenever we have that opportunity, please use your legislative power to push forward and bring change. And then let us worry about it in Jeff City. If it happens, then hell, we're going to fight it. And I'll take any questions if...
All right. Alderman Vaccaro, any questions?
Sure. Comments too, because Representative, I assume you're speaking to what I said.
I was speaking to everything that everybody said, not just you in particular.
Okay, so the minimum wage, we passed it here, Jeff City took it away. The abortions, we passed it here, Jeff City took it away. I don't disagree with a lot of what's being said. What I'm saying is a lot of this needs to be done with the police department on their policy, because when we do these things like this, and you're a representative up there and you know what you're dealing with, and it's hard to be a Democrat in Jeff City right now, you know that the governor will come back around, and what I will assume, and I'm just assuming, what will happen is if we pass something like this, Jeff City will come back and take away local control of the police, because, in my opinion, we should be working with the police department on policy. They can't come back from Jeff City. Now, if Jeff City was arranged different, there were more Democrats that would be sympathetic to this, I would say, yeah, pass something like this. But by passing this, I really think what's going to happen, and I think if you look at what goes on in Jeff City and look at our past board bills that have come out of here, I will be willing to actually, and I believe Jeff City will come back and either take control back, because there's also going to be confusion, because this bill affects city police, but it doesn't enact anything with the state highway patrol.
So I want to answer that question as well. I'm sorry not to cut you off.
Well, let me just finish.
Okay, go ahead.
Go at one time. So other departments, surrounding departments, we have mutual aid with. So, I mean, it's not just the City of St. Louis Police Department. Now we're talking about policy in multiple departments. I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
So I believe what happens when we call in somebody else from a different jurisdiction, when we call in help, there's still a point person. There's still a point entity, right? In most cases, when it comes to St. Louis, what we've known it to be was Brian Rossamano and St. Louis Metropolitan Police. So when it comes to legislation and fixing legislation, that's something that can be worked out as to what that actually looks like, and detailing it into legislation as to orders, what particular policy, so on and so forth. One of the things you said assume, and you said I think, and I understand you're coming from your experience.
Well, based off of the last two things we did.
Off the last two bills.
Sure.
Absolutely.
And do I think that? I believe it'll happen.
So I don't want to get too far in the weeds about minimum wage, but that was enacted from Jeff City, that particular legislation. I understand what you're saying. I wholeheartedly respect what you're saying. Only thing I'm saying is we have to start to deal with police accountability. We can't just push it off and say, well, it needs to be done in Jeff City, because as you just said, that there's a particular makeup in Jeff City when we have 163 representatives and 46 of them are Democrat, and it's so pro-police that's hard legislation to put forward. But what I've learned about some of our Republican colleagues is that when we have a particular initiative and we begin to work together on certain things and have those conversations about what's going on, they become a little more compassionate, for lack of a better terms, for the things that are going on in our particular communities, because one thing that they do truly believe in is local control. And so I definitely understand what you're saying, and I respect what you're saying, but this is a St. Louis issue that we need to be dealing with right now. And I just feel like we should be pushing forth legislation. We have the opportunity to.
And I won't, we can always debate this later. I just strongly believe, like you said, they're very pro-police, and I will admit that I'm very pro-police, but I think they will act if we do. It's just an opinion, and again, everybody's got one, so, you know. But anyway, Bruce, I appreciate, Representative, I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Okay. Alderman Cone?
Being a representative for the city of St. Louis, have you had conversations with colleagues down in Jefferson City about enacting legislation of your own that would mirror this?
So I have had conversations with 3 representatives in particular, 2 of which are from Franklin County and 1 from St. Charles County. Not about this particular legislation, but about our use of deadly force, the language in our use of deadly force, how vague it is, and how it talks about a reasonable offense and a reasonable danger, and really defining what reasonable is, and trying to find other legislation from around the country that has maybe a more strict definition of what that use of deadly force should look like. One conversations that I have had have been tailored around protests for those of my colleagues that don't understand, that don't get it. Some that were truly upset. I even went and did a couple radio shows in rural areas to talk about what's going on and the police response, and give them just eyewitness facts, not myths, not anything that I heard, but things that I actually saw and went through. And I do honestly believe, being cautiously optimistic, that we are opening their eyes to some things, and they're starting to understand. Not that they get it, not that they'll get it overnight or, you know, in the next couple months, but the conversation has been started.
And just out of curiosity, I mean, do you have a relationship with the Speaker of the House?
Yes. Yes.
Do you communicate fairly regularly with that person or their staff?
So not as regularly now, but one thing that will be happening is I'm actually bringing the Speaker and a few of the Republicans up to St. Louis to come around to go into some of our economically distressed communities, because on our bus tour we get to see all the pretty stuff. We get to see all the good stuff about St. Louis, but we don't go into the communities that need the help and need the resources. So that's something that'll happen right before Christmas. But I do have a relationship with Speaker Richardson.
And the reason I ask that is because, you know, I'm somewhat familiar with Jefferson City, and legislation, particularly anything that would deal with local control of our police department or you know, police benefits or police policies. You know, the Speaker determines the flow of legislation in the House and who's recognized to speak on it, where the bills go, how they're assigned, all of that. The Speaker actually probably has more latitude in Jefferson City than our own President of the Board of Aldermen in terms of
Absolutely.
You know, how legislation flows. So have you heard of any legislation that would take back control of the police department from the city of St. Louis?
They have. This was something that came up last year, and from my understanding with the Speaker and the former floor leader, Mike Searpoy, that there's no desire to try and take away local control of the police, because that's one thing that Republicans as a whole feel about it. And when it comes to police community relations and different things that's going on, I was appointed chair of the Police Community Relations Committee, as well as I'm ranking minority member on public safety. So we have those conversations, and most of the time I'm the only non-police officer in the room, because we have so many officers or ex-officers who are legislators now. But that conversation has come up, and they have no desire, from what's being said. Not saying that we can, 100% trust them, but they have no desire to take back local control of police, state control.
I'd add to that they're one of the largest Republican donors in the state of Missouri, Rex Singfeld, whose name is not generally well received down here, is one of the largest donors down in Jefferson City and was one of the largest advocates for local control of the police department. So, you know, if they wanted to keep seeing those big checks rolling in, you know, I'm sure that they're probably not going to test it.
Absolutely.
But for your own information, which I'm sure you're already aware of, but you know, otherwise, you know, thank you for coming down here and providing your perspective, Representative. It's very much appreciated.
No problem. Thank
you.
Alderwoman Hubbard, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions, but I have a comment. In regards to your comment about us using Jefferson City as a scapegoat, I think that misleads the public in a way, because we've made some decisions down here, some decisions that we knew that would probably get shut down by Jefferson City, but we did it because we knew, like for minimum wage, we knew that would be the right thing to do. But I think it's important for us to try to work in conjunction with Jefferson City to make sure that we're making the right decision and we're not just jumping out there feeding our constituents a lot of fodder about something that we know won't take place. And in regards to a scapegoat, I think you used the scapegoat saying that, you know, you brought up the dynamics of Jefferson City with you being in the minority. You knew that going in you would be in the minority. So I think it's important for you as a state legislator to be willing to work across the aisle and do whatever you can to help resolve some of our issues locally, because we just can't sit back and say, okay, well, you know, we don't want to push forward because of Jefferson City on an issue that we kind of know when you look at the process of things that we can't jump out before them, but then at the same time you say, well, oh, it's Republican control, I can't do nothing. So I think so that we can quit misleading the public, quit putting issues before them that we ultimately know are going to get kicked back, let's try to work together and get some things done. We've already elected to lead. We know times are hard, you know, down here and up there, and let's do what we can do to actually do something for the public instead of putting their rhetoric out here saying we use things as a scapegoat. We got to get past that.
So, with all due respect, to speak to your comment, me talking about the makeup of Jefferson City, I never said that we can't get anything done, because I'm a firm believer that I went down there to get something done, and we've actually got some stuff done. Only thing I was saying is that in the past year, the only thing that we've heard from certain aldermen, I'll say, is about what's going to happen in Jeff City. That wasn't a dig at all of the aldermen, but so only thing I'm saying is that maybe scapegoat wasn't the right word. Okay. And if anybody took it that way, I will apologize. Only thing I'm saying is when we have the opportunity to do what's right, like you said, when you knew that this would probably be a hard piece of legislation in other terms to pass because of Jefferson City, you still did it because you knew what was right. And I believe this is what's right for the people, for all of our constituents. And I also agree wholeheartedly about being able to work together with all of our aldermen and state representatives working together for the communities that we actually represent. So I'm all for working together.
Okay.
No further comments.
Alderwoman Spencer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Franks, for being here today.
Thank you.
I was curious about when you started speaking to us today about Jefferson City and kind of not using that as sort of a crutch or a reason not to do something. Was that particularly related to this bill or maybe other bills before us?
So, it wasn't even about necessarily the bills either, because we have heard that when it comes to legislation, but in talking to different aldermen, one of the rhetorics that's put out is the fact that we're going to come back and take everything back every time St. Louis City does something, which isn't true. There's been plenty of legislation passed by the board that could have been preempted in a lot of spaces. Realistically, most of the bills passed could be preempted by the state, but they haven't been. And so it was basically just saying, look, you have an opportunity like Alderwoman Hubbard said, you have the opportunity to do something right when it comes to the citizens of the city of St. Louis, and not saying, oh, well, we're going to need, it's going to go through Jeff City, or it has to go through Jeff City, or Jeff City's going to come back and preempt it by just getting the legislation done on a local level is.
We've done several things here at the board in the last couple of years that I'm aware of that took action that Jefferson City wasn't taking and did some local things. Maybe they're small steps, but for example, we did a payday loan bill. When the state took away our air quality control program, we brought that back here locally. But I think one of the concerns might be when there's state laws that already exist that preempt some of the action that St. Louis City can take. For example, with the payday loan bill, we couldn't implement our own interest rate here because the state literally already had a law in place that prohibited us from doing that. So it is important in some regards to make sure that we know what state laws already exist that prevent this legislative body from acting in the best interest of our citizens. And with that, I must admit my ignorance with regards to what the state has or already maybe can preempt us with regards to this particular legislation, because I'm personally not aware of any. Of what the state can do since we do have local control. I understand there is a concern of maybe the state taking that back, but I think given the statewide vote that took place that gave us local control, that might be a difficult task to undertake. Are you aware of any, I know you are advising us not to use these, any statewide laws to kind of prevent us from taking action, but are you aware of any that would prevent us?
So I'm not aware of any as far as when it comes to police statute. And one thing that Alderman MacArthur said, which spoke to a few of the things, was police policy. So I know most of it could be police policy, but as far as a particular law or a particular statute, what I've looked into and have dealt with for the past year had to do with our statutes on peace officers, our post commission, and our statute on use of deadly force, which are three of the only, when it comes to actual law enforcement laws or statutes that I've personally dealt with.
Do we have any state laws related to assembly or to your knowledge, or any state laws related to the use of chemical agents?
So the use of chemical agents, not that I'm aware of. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But I know as far as assembly in our First Amendment, basically just going back into the Constitution. But as far as a specific law, I'm not aware of.
Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Alderman Muhammad, any questions?
I have no questions for the participants, sir.
Okay. Alderwoman Boyd.
I do. How you doing?
How you doing?
The question I want to ask, and I have been asked because I've been reading a lot, but my question is the Washington, D.C. statute that I'm assuming that Alderwoman Green, she went by that statute for this bill. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, you would have to ask Alderwoman Green.
Saying yeah.
Okay.
She's saying yeah. And so I heard you loud and clear when you were saying that, your understanding that the state doesn't want to take the police back.
Mm-hmm.
But what my understanding, what I'm seeing is the city of St. Louis has taken on the police department, but it was no plan in place. So it's real clear that as the safety committee, we need to understand what the policies are of the police department. And so I was trying to read to compare what Washington, D.C. did to what this bill is saying. And so what I'm asking Alderwoman Green, and if I'm not out of line, my mentor let me know, because I'm trying to figure this part out. But What I'm asking is, if we could sit down to look at both of these, and then look into the police policies to make sure that if she submits this bill and we accept it, it has meat in it, because I'm a person, I don't like half-doing things. And so what I'm saying is that we don't have all the dots connected, and so we need to be able to connect them so we can, make the right
Absolutely.
decision. That's what I'm
Absolutely.
asking. Yeah.
And from a state legislative standpoint, I'll be happy to sit down and help aid and whatever, or be of any assistance and learn at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
That completes you? Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's-
The struggle to get local control was a protracted, long-term struggle. And being one of those involved with a number of other community organizations, Rick Singfield was a recent player on the field in relationship to that overall effort. When we first tried to pass civilian oversight back in 2005, and then when we got it passed in 2006, and then the mayor vetoed it at the time, what we did was to have a conversation with the mayor about what he would support. That was Mayor Slay. He said he would support our work and effort towards local control. So the work towards local control actually goes back to the 90s, the mid-90s, as we began that effort. Being one of those, including Alderman Boyd, who has traveled from up and down the highway to Jefferson City, there was much disdain about the city of St. Louis when we went to the state to testify about local control and civilian oversight. We heard comments like, St. Louis is a strange animal. Quote, unquote, it is an unusual place. These types of terms were used to describe the city of St. Louis when we are its representatives sitting there talking to other state senators and state representatives at the numerous hearings that we went to about local control, trying to convince the legislators to support and to give back local control of the St. Louis Police Department. So I can only imagine what you have to face up there today, and if any of those attitudes have significantly changed since our time of going back and forth across the highway to Jefferson City. I do not want anybody to walk away with the feeling that, and I know that was not the Alderman Cohn's intent, but as you know, that Rick Singfield was a major force behind getting local control. That was not the case. That was a grassroots community effort combined primarily at the time, because most of these people were not on the board, with the Aldermanic African American Caucus. We were pushing for local control and civilian oversight of the police department for at least 2 decades before we were able to get it to the place it is today. The city of Kansas City decided to keep their police department under the control of the state.
Yeah.
But we took to the position of passing in any and everything we possibly can to bring a greater humanity back to the city of St. Louis that we possibly could pass, and let the state do whatever it does, and we would just have to meet them in court.
absolutely.
That was the position that we took, and still some of us take up on this board right now. So we feel there's certainly merit to this particular piece of legislation. We're going to have a lot more discussion than this about it, because we do need to get a really grasp of the present policies and things like that. It was difficult to begin to integrate the police department into the city of St. Louis and how the city operates, and some resistance as well as a part of the St. Louis Police Department and its administration at that time. But it is beginning to happen. So I do understand what you have some notion, I don't go up there every day like you do, some notion of what we're facing there. But I did not want anyone to walk away with the feeling that Rick Singfield was a major player in making sure that we got local control. And I know that was not the alderman's position, but I just wanted to be clear as one of those who was pushing to make sure that we got both local control and civilian oversight of the police department.
Gotcha.
So you were not in office at the time, and we hadn't met at the time. So hopefully I gave you a little history that made a difference. But if it didn't, I still spoke my word.
Always.
Okay, then. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have something? Oh, he had one further piece for you.
Just quickly, when you do that bus tour, I'd like to go on it, because maybe I can learn
Oh, absolutely. And we don't have to wait on a bus tour. You can just hop in my car anytime you're ready. I'll take you.
Well, I'm ready. I've been up, obviously, when I was running for sheriff, I was up in different neighborhoods and saw different needs. I would like to go with you. I'd like to
Absolutely.
discuss how we start to bring this all together and work together to actually make policy that I believe will work. So, you got my phone number. Call me. I'd be more than happy. I'm pretty free next week. I'd be happy to go anywhere, look through any part of any neighborhood. I'm always interested. I have been in certain neighborhoods with some of the other aldermen, but we used to, when I first started, we used to go to lunch in different wards every time one alderman would host something. But I would certainly, and I've been up with Sam Moore in his ward, and I was up for the dedication of the football field and all that. But you get my cell number, I'd be more than happy to go up there.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alderwoman, you have because we do want to get to the list.
So Representative Franks was the last person I was calling. I'm happy to allow you, have you open it up for questions. I do want to say just one thing. The state did not nullify our reproductive health care ordinance. They made a lot of noise about it. They passed something at the state level that amounts to trap laws that were already found unconstitutional. It did nothing to impact our local ordinance, and I think that that's very important for this committee to understand, and it's really important for aldermen to understand that for all the noise that was made legally, nothing happened to our local ordinance.
There was changes made, and we can debate that. I would think
Right,
this is
let's
not the
stay
time,
on-
but
on
I'd
Want
be
to
more
clarify
than happy
that,
to
so we're
debate
not
that.
making broad assumptions about something that's not exactly true.
Well,
But
I'd
that,
be
that,
happy to debate it because I disagree.
right. That completes your last guess. Okay, then we will go to the list of others who have signed up to speak. The rules are that we go both pro and con, those who are in support of the bill, and then we alternate between those in support to those who are against. So we will first start out with David Witt. I believe I have it correct. Please come forward and just identify yourself, and we'll keep the comments to about 3 minutes if you can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak. My name is David Witt. I'm a member of a small group called We Cop Watch. We're an advocacy group that supports citizens that go out and film. We also film. We educate our community on their rights and what they should do in the situation dealing with police and a whole slew of other things. I'm here today just to get right into it because I got 3 minutes. About the one point, I really do support this whole bill, and I really took concern and interest to the part about citizens filming the police and police harassment and things of that nature. I myself, I have been dealing with the police since 2014, holding police accountable, and I've seen how I myself and also other members of the community have been, under attack, far more than other people fighting for, like you said, fighting for 15 or fighting for health care. When you're dealing with the police, it's a different monster entirely. I've been arrested several times for filming the police, and they said I was interfering. My property was taken more than one occasion. Last time, my camera didn't get back to me for 3 months. I was held against my will. I consider it kidnapping, seeing as how the offense that they charged me for was a cite and release. I've also been detained for over 6 or 7 hours, and my own people could not locate me, and they kept playing the shuffle game. I'm here, I'm here. Other people have been charged for offenses, and there has been no, accountability on any of these boards to support. And, after the ACLU in 2014 had said that citizens had the right to film, this was a very vague, situation. And so citizens went out still not understanding their right. The police was not properly informed of how to handle citizens. I think that you all really should consider supporting this bill because of the fact that the police department is very powerful. And how you think that you have you are in control of the police department? No one is. The police is control of themselves. Even if the state decides to get back control, the police are being control of themselves. They have money, they have politicians, they have all sorts of people. Nobody's in control of the police. And the problem is, the citizens know. If you look in the audience right now, the black community are targeted far more than any other race in America. Now, that could be argued to people that's not black, okay? But I know firsthand, okay? Now, everybody is being treated like black people, okay? If you understand that, okay? And when you're dealing with protests, the cops are still treating protest actions different than regular citizens on the street. And I think that right now, I'm very disappointed in everyone. I'm disappointed in the board. I feel as though that no one was really taking this issue serious. When we came here today, it started late. You know, people, you all seem to have already given up. We're not even going to try to fight, and that seems to be always, every time we decide to fight against the police department, nobody wants to fight. And I thought it was kind of funny to even mention different things that you all have argued. It don't got nothing to do with the police, and no one is still addressing this problem with the police, seeing as how, like I said, you look in the audience, this building should be filled. Police accountability has been on the topic of conversations. People are not here because they're in fear of being targeted for supporting these type of things. And so I think that you all really need to, I'm ending with that, but I think that you really need to get, I mean, like right now, you got to get on one of the other side of this thing. And this bill, everything in this thing right here, is already constitutionally backed. The thing is, they're just clarifying certain things. And what you're telling the people when you don't support this is you're basically saying that to allow the police and the court systems to vaguely hold these cases is constitutional. Thank you.
Thank you. You'd like to make a comment?
A quick comment.
Okay, Alderman Vaccaro.
Just a quick comment. I think the reason you don't see a lot of people here is the timing of the meeting, because I can tell you we've had evening meetings, which will probably happen, I'm sure, again on this one, where not only is it completely filled, there's extra rows of chairs brought in. I think the timing of the meeting, I wouldn't say that not having a bigger crowd here is because of fear, but a lot of people have jobs that it's inconvenient time. And in the past, we've had later night meetings, we've had meetings out in the neighborhoods, and there's certainly a bigger crowd. It's just a comment as to why
Thank
you
you.
may not see a lot of people.
Okay.
Thank you. I just happened to have been the chair to call evening meetings when it wasn't fashionable at the board. John Ziegler is our next speaker.
My name is John Ziegler, Revolutionary Z, a live streamer. I'm in favor of this bill. I testified in front of you guys last month. And so you guys know the whole story, obviously, about the first kettling. I'm not going to go through that with you today. I'll try to keep it short and keep to basically what I am familiar with, which is being a citizen journalist out in the streets and pepper spray. I hate to say I'm an expert in that, but sadly I am, and it's from documenting police here in St. Louis. I've been pepper sprayed more than a dozen times, filming the police over the years, at least half of those here in the city of St. Louis. My very first time, sadly, was on Grand and Arsenal when we were surrounded by police, and I was standing with a bunch of other journalists on the sidewalk. A cop just came up to me and shot me point blank in the eyes with pepper spray. Really for no reason other than retaliation at that point, and that I was holding a camera trying to document what was going on. And that started a pattern of behavior that I've witnessed over the last 3 years in St. Louis County and the surrounding area. Police going to pepper spray first, not to try to disperse potentially harmful people to get them out of there, but it's basically whatever that officer deems he wants to do, who he wants to retaliate against, and how he decides to use that pepper spray. What we learned in court with the ACLU this last month is that they call those big blue cans the foggers. And technically, they're not supposed to use those foggers. Those are considered chemical munitions until they give a dispersal order warning us that they're going to be using chemical munitions. I've been sprayed with those foggers, again, about half a dozen times in St. Louis never given a dispersal warning or warning that I was going to be sprayed with chemical munitions. And when I was sprayed with those foggers, and I know it's happened to countless other people. It happened to another live streamer in a wheelchair over here just last month as well. And that just can't continue anymore here in St. Louis. I mean, any of you should realize that. This should be a no-brainer on this. Now, to get something that's not my expertise real quick in my last minute here, I'm not a politician, I'll leave that to you guys, but I'm hearing just what you guys are talking about, how, and you bring up a good point, I see what you're saying about Jefferson City might shoot this down, so just to keep that in mind, I don't think that should be deterrence to passing a bill like this that's this important, because even if you know 100% they're going to turn that down, it brings precedent, maybe to other cities to bring up bills like this. It brings possibly a national spotlight. So first Jefferson City shuts down your minimum wage, now they shut down police reform. The two biggest problems in St. Louis, poverty and brutal police, and you got your state not allowing you to take care of that locally. Well, maybe that'll help you get to the next step of where you need to be or where you guys can go with various legislation or how to pressure, which is politics, pressure the citizenry of the state of Missouri and also the politicians in Jefferson City. Sorry, directly, I'm not staring at you directly, but...
I'll comment to it.
Let's let him complete. Are you finished?
Yeah, that's...
No, I'll comment to it. I honestly believe a little bit different than you do. I don't think passing stuff that you feel is not going to make it. I think we're better off working together with the police to put policy in place to address these things. There's a lot of legitimate complaints in there. But I do think policy. I think that maybe even the live streamers should get some sort of a badge or something that identifies them as press so that they're not mixed in with, say, a crowd. If they say disperse, there's a lot of things we can work on, but why would we want to pass something if we feel in our heart it's not going to go anywhere when we know we can pass stuff?
How does that, can you tell me, a lot of us don't know how that works.
So on how what works, working with the
Well, you're
police?
saying if not passing a bill like this, let's pass policy. What are the steps in place?
Okay, pardon me. We wanted to hear your comments, not to go back and forth like this.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
So if you finished your comments,
That was-
we thank you. We do thank you. We do have another speaker, Philip Weeks, I believe it is. There's been no opposed. Right, that's why I'm calling only pros. Mhm.
Okay, so my name is Philip Weeks, and I'm speaking in favor of passage of this bill. First of all, so I've been a protester, I've been a legal observer, and I've been a member of another group that actually tries to observe what the police are doing. I've also been a resident of the city of St. Louis. That's one of the reasons why I'm a protester, why I'm a legal observer, and why I do the other things in my life. Now, I'm not here just to speak in favor of this bill, but the reasons why this bill should be passed. The police department in St. Louis and the police departments across the United States have a problem with escalation, okay, instead of de-escalation. Now, if you got rid of the problems of escalation, you wouldn't have half as many protests. Okay, so the problem with a lot of the de-escalation is it's just in training, and it's not in policy. So you need to have policy of de-escalation and reward the police officers for de-escalation. Okay, now I wanted to speak about a couple of other things. Regarding policy, I was on a jury trial just recently. Policy is great, okay, but on this jury trial, a person named Lieutenant Amy Funk testified. And she testified according to the policy that she did not regard that she should follow. And in defense of not following the policy of the St. Louis Police Department, she said, "I did not break the law." Okay, so policy is great, but even when you have someone under oath in the city courts who doesn't even think it's important to follow the policy, what good is your policy? I think you guys also need to have the opportunity to look at police policy, whether it's followed or not. Because what I saw was such a disregard for policy. I don't know if your policy recommendations are going to do anything, or any of the policies you enact. Like David Witt says, these police officers have absolute control. When they disregard policy, what are they doing? Okay, they're saying, we know what to do, we have our guidelines. The guidelines that the city outlines are not important. So, one, I agree with the gentleman from the ACLU, the MacArthur Institute. There are constitutional reasons to pass this. When you don't obey by constitutional laws, you're creating a society that goes into dystopia. Okay? And I'll tell you one other thing. When process becomes punishment, it happens all the time with the Justice Center next door. When you can't predict the release of protesters, when you have people, not only protesters there, who are giving bail, and it's impossible to find out what the bail amount is, and then they say, well, you can just, either you have two choices. Your bail is $70, it's $80, you can make the payment of $80, not get $10 back, or you can go to the bar next door where they have a cash register. Okay? This is Kafkaesque dystopia. To go and say, we don't care, we're going to keep you here for 3 hours, not tell you the bail amount, get to the window, tell you to go next door to the bar to get change. I'm just bringing that up because, one, it's always shocked me. Two, you're not punishing the person in the jail. You're punishing the person who's trying to get them out. They have jobs, they have places to go, they're not being treated with respect. As a citizen and resident of St. Louis, I think that has to change.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Reverend Aaron, I believe it's Conahan. You can correct me when you come up.
Good morning, and thank you for taking time to listen to us citizens on this bill. I'm Reverend Aaron Conahan. I'm a resident of the 6th Ward, and I serve as pastor at Oak Hill Presbyterian Church, which is in the 15th Ward. For the past few months, I've joined my neighbors in speaking out in the streets simply to say that Black Lives Matter, and we want the police to stop killing us. While we've been doing that, with so many others, I have been tear gassed, I have been pepper sprayed, I have been shoved around by police officers, and I have been arrested. I've been told by one police officer one instruction, and then I'll turn around and another officer is screaming in my face something completely contradictory. I watched one colleague tackled to the ground by a swarm of officers and pepper sprayed while on the ground. I watched as a neighbor was both sprayed and tased at the same time. I provided first aid to a woman sprayed so badly with chemical agents that her entire back, she was wearing a tank top, her entire back was dripping with orange liquid, and she was curled up in the fetal position on the ground. I sat with an elected official pepper sprayed within inches of his face simply for asking officers a question and asking it wearing the wrong color skin at the wrong time. I watched an armored vehicle roll down a city street and indiscriminately spray tear gas on the neighborhood without warning, without cause, while myself and 6 friends and one of your colleagues were walking to our cars following police instructions to go home for the night. There also happened to be a bunch of our neighbors out on the deck at the Chase Park Hotel that night who were also sprayed. I've seen legal observers shoved. I've seen colleagues aggressively arrested while trying to help other citizens to safety. I've seen members of the press sprayed with chemical agents without warning and arrested. On the night I was arrested, we were circled in, as Representative Frank spoke about. The officers were walking toward us in full riot gear with their batons out, with shields out, to people sitting quietly on the sidewalk. As neighbors tried to leave because they were given instructions from these people in full riot gear in front of them saying, move, 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 as people tried to leave, as we asked officers, can we leave? They said, no, sit down, shut up, you're getting arrested. I was sitting on the ground and I watched an officer use a shield to slam down on the arms of 2 senior women sitting in front of me who were sitting on the sidewalk quietly, doing nothing. They were no threat to public safety. My concern is, then I was arrested, I was thrown in a van, I was in custody for more than 12 hours, I was never once given a charge, I was never once given a piece of paperwork, I was never told why I was there, I was never told what my next steps were or why I was being released. I was fingerprinted and photographed and not given any legal information whatsoever. I still have not heard from anyone as to what my charges may or may not have been. I do not believe this is the way that an agency of authority charged with protecting and serving, paid for by myself and my neighbors, should be treating citizens who are expressing their First Amendment rights. We need more accountability around the use of chemical agents, and I believe this bill provides that. We need to be more clear about how and where and when to declare unlawful assemblies, and providing a safe way for citizens who want to and choose to disperse at will. We need to train officers. I loved that there was a line about making sure officers' training is provided for in this bill. I think that that's critically important. I am a Christian, and my tradition began in the streets. It moved through the streets, where God's self, spoke a truth from the streets to people in power. We here as American citizens and residents are part of a tradition of valuing the voices of people, bringing change through public action, of taking our demands to the streets. This has been and continues to be one of the ways that we bring change, and one of the ways we reach our elected officials, and one of the ways we as citizens influence policy. These are our values, and these are also our constitutional rights, and I believe this bill helps us protect those rights for our citizens.
Thank you. We also have, I believe it's Dylan Newman.
Thank you, sir. I guess I want to start by saying that I understand that...
Would you identify yourself?
Oh, yes, sir. I'm Dylan Newbold.
Newbold.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I understand that policing a city like St. Louis is probably a really challenging task. It's very large. There are lots of different groups of people who have different interests that sometimes conflict with each other. And I have a lot of respect for people who go out and put themselves at risk to try to protect the rights of their citizens. But I've got to say that our police force contains a lot of people who, if they're pursuing that, are also pursuing other goals. I was arrested on September 18th, and really this was just an assault that I feel I'll never receive any sort of justice for, no matter how I try to pursue it. I showed up at the intersection of Washington and Tucker at about 11 o'clock. I would have come sooner, but I'd been out of town all weekend, sort of watching from a distance after the Stockley verdict as citizens express their right to express dissatisfaction at how our justice system is handling incidents of unnecessary police aggression and murder. And when I got there, I was there for maybe 20 minutes. I saw nothing really illegal happening. People were standing on the sidewalks. They wouldn't even jaywalk. They're just sort of standing around watching the police. And I'm sorry if all of you know what happened, and I'm reiterating things that you've heard before, but this is my experience. I was never given any order to disperse, never had any reason to believe that I couldn't be there. Within about 20 minutes, we were completely surrounded on all four sides by police. I didn't know what was happening. They were stomping their sticks in the ground and like ordering people to move back, but they wouldn't give us anywhere to move. I and many other people went up to the lines and like shouted, like asking where we could go, if there was some way to escape, and nobody responded at all. The only time I was really given an order was when they finally had us all densely packed into one street corner, and they told us all to get down on the ground. Everybody complied with that. I was then given another order to put my phone away. I complied with that as well, but before I could, I was sprayed in the face with pepper spray. I've been wearing a bandana and goggles because I've been at events like this before, and I know that police misuse these chemical agents all the time. And that seemed to anger the officer that sprayed me, so he ripped off my goggles and ripped off my bandana and drug me out in the street. While I did that, another officer standing about 2 feet away sprayed me all over my face that was now exposed. And this mace is terrible stuff. Like, this isn't pepper spray. Like, you know, pepper spray, like, irritates your throat a little bit, and you want to leave, and maybe your eyes water a little bit, like, or I'm sorry, tear gas. This is a whole different, like, mace or pepper spray is a liquid that they apply directly to your skin and eyes and mouth and nose, and it causes horrible pain. It's horribly disoriented. From that point on, I felt like it was like a nightmare. In addition to being pepper sprayed and then having my hands bound behind my back so I couldn't do anything about it, despite the fact that I told over a dozen officers that this pain was terrible and I felt like I couldn't breathe properly, and it was just horrifying. I asked maybe a dozen people for help, and nobody gave me anything but either, I don't know, people shaming me for even being there. One officer stood over me after they did this and said, "Are you proud now?" Like, said something really weird, like, "Are you going to tell your wife about this tonight? You better not." It was really strange. They had this weird macho attitude. They were excited to punish us. This same officer stood over me and said, "I'm so glad I work in St. Louis because I have to do shit like this." And yeah, anyway, my hands were also zip tied so tight that they were horribly ischemic. It's probably over an hour and a half before I was able to get an officer to cut these zip ties off my hands, despite the fact that I'd asked a dozen people. I told them that I'd lost sensation in them about 15 minutes after they put them on, and then had to keep them on my hands for over an hour after that. I was left with nerve damage. I had to go to the ER for that. I still haven't fully recovered from this. This has been almost 2 months now. Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of things in this bill that would have prevented what happened to me and what happened to many other people that night, and I really hope it passes. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Alderwoman, that completes our list. If you...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand, I was trying to take notes throughout of things that the committee was requesting, moving forward. How do you want to handle that in terms of getting to me if there are specific things that the committee wants?
Yeah, I would suggest that if any committee members have specific information that you want from the sponsor, you can send it to her or to me.
Okay.
And I can get it to you. There were some things that I took notes on.
Yes.
That I'll get with you.
Okay.
About, including others that I'd like to hear some testimony from.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds good for me.
All right, then. I know that you also have some amendments that you will be proposing when we come back on the bill.
Yeah, they're mostly just language changes to make sure that language matches intent.
So. Did you have a question, Alderman?
I do. Alderwoman, I am curious, in the bill, it doesn't seem to include any kind of, I don't want to use the word punishment, but if the policy or, ordinance isn't followed, what happens?
I believe it says in the bill, I forget I don't have it in front of me at the moment,
Yeah,
but
I've been trying to find it, but I can't.
there was a clause in there about disciplinary action as a result of it. But I do agree, I think that there probably is some work that we could do on what the accountability piece looks like on that. It was some conversations that I've been having.
Okay. It doesn't seem to be, if it is in here, it's vague, and maybe that's intentional to leave up to management or personnel or what have you, but we can have another conversation about that.
Okay.
All right. I believe that completes it today. We thank everyone who came out to testify today, and those that your special guests as well. We'll be calling another committee hearing after we get all the other information together.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no other items on the agenda. Our meeting's adjourned.